The man named Virgil was just relieving himself when he accidentally discovered a palm-sized chunk of gold. But instead of shouting in excitement, his first reaction was to nervously glance at his companion behind him. Fortunately, his companion Keith was focused on fixing the car and didn't notice anything unusual. Relieved, the man quietly began calculating how he could secure a lifetime of wealth for himself. However, his sneaky behavior quickly caught Keith's attention. Thinking Virgil had run into trouble, he considerately called out to ask if he needed help. Realizing he couldn't keep it a secret any longer, he let out a sigh, then pretended to be astonished and turned back to whisper. The moment the words left his mouth, he began to regret it. But by then, Keith had already crouched beside him. The moment his hand touched it, he was so shocked that he couldn't speak, even forgetting to swat away the flies he usually found most annoying. To verify if the gold was real, Keith pulled out a high-powered lighter from his pocket and directed its 1,000-degree flame at the yellow lump. After a long while, as they watched the object glow even brighter under the heat, the two were so overwhelmed with excitement that they stood frozen in place for a full half-hour. Then, snapping out of it, they hurriedly grabbed shovels. What they had thought was just a small chunk turned out to be merely the tip of an iceberg of endless wealth, a realization that only came after they had dug until they were utterly exhausted. The two dug desperately for an entire afternoon, yet the chunk of gold still had no visible bottom. No matter how hard they tried, exhausting every ounce of their strength, they couldn't budge it in the slightest. Collapsed from exhaustion, they suddenly remembered they had tools. Scrambling to take out a rope, they tightly secured it around the golden mass. The engine roared, the wheels spun furiously in place, but even when the steel cable snapped under the strain, the gold mountain remained completely unmoved. Only then did they fully grasp the reality before them. This was a fortune so immense that even generations of reckless spending wouldn't deplete it. But they had no time to celebrate. The howls of wolves echoed across the desolate Gobi Desert, making it clear that the greatest threat to their newfound wealth was their own survival. Unwilling to give up, they hastily gathered branches and lit a fire to ward off the beasts, while also keeping themselves from freezing to death in the bone-chilling night. At this moment, the two were still working together, but when night fell, neither could sleep. Faced with such immense wealth, both feared that if they were the first to fall asleep, the other might kill them in the middle of the night. The tense stalemate lasted for a long time until Keith, unable to endure it any longer, finally spoke. He reasoned that with their current resources and money, there was no way they could move such a massive chunk of gold. So, he suggested that one of them return to rent an excavator and bring back supplies while the other stayed behind to guard it. Then, they would take the gold and become rich together. With no other option, Virgil agreed on the surface, but deep down, he didn't fully trust Keith. He feared that the moment he left, Keith would act on his own. To ensure he could keep an eye on the gold and ease his own worries, he volunteered to stay behind as the guard. The next morning, after reaching an agreement, they began dividing their limited supplies. However, Virgil failed to notice that Keith was secretly scheming. He didn't find it suspicious at all when Keith took most of the water under the pretense of cooling the engine. Completely blinded by greed, Virgil didn't even question why Keith left him with only a small portion of food. He firmly believed that Keith would return soon with the excavator. But Keith had his own fears. He worried that the moment he left, Virgil might find someone else to partner with. So, before departing, he repeatedly warned Virgil to stay put and wait for his return. Keith never expected that the moment he left, Virgil would spring into action. After carefully burying the gold mine, he immediately dashed off in the opposite direction of Keith's departure. However, this wasn't an act of betrayal. Virgil was simply afraid that someone else might discover the gold and worried that, with his injured leg, he wouldn't be able to fend off unknown dangers. So, he decided to find himself a strategic location. Though only a few dozen meters away from the gold, his new spot allowed him to keep watch while also ensuring his own safety. With a relatively secure temporary shelter, He now had to deal with the extreme temperature differences, hiding from the scorching sun during the day and finding warmth at night to keep wild animals at bay. To survive until Keith returned, Virgil forced himself to endure the blistering heat and gathered a large pile of firewood for the night. At the same time, he carefully rationed his dwindling supply of water and food. Lost in dreams of his future as a billionaire, Virgil drifted through his first night guarding the gold in a half-conscious haze. With food and water running low, he was extremely cautious every time he took a sip or a bite. Keith had said the round trip would take 5 days, so he had to ration what little he had. Fearing that constant exposure to the scorching sun would deplete his water too quickly, he reluctantly made a tough decision. He would take the firewood he had painstakingly gathered and search for a more suitable shelter. Luckily, he found one. A plane wreck. Not only was it just a few hundred meters from the gold mine, but it was also far safer than a withered tree. Setting down his belongings, Virgil decided to establish camp there. But even after securing a place to survive, he couldn't stop thinking about his gold. Unable to shake his unease, he made another decision. He kicked down a pile of plane debris and, with great effort, dragged it all back to the gold mine. After all his efforts, the scorching sun gave him a rash. Even worse, though he could now keep an eye on the gold mine, the exhaustion had drained his strength, and his remaining supplies wouldn't last much longer. Sitting beside the gold, he fended off anything that posed a threat to his survival. At the same time, unwilling to give up, he desperately hammered away at the gold with a rock, managing to chip off a small piece. Just this tiny fragment was enough to let him live comfortably for the rest of his life. But he wasn't satisfied with just that. With his dwindling supplies, he had no choice but to call his companion. He explained his situation and urged Keith to hurry back. However, Keith claimed he had run into trouble. The original 5-day plan wouldn't be enough. He told Virgil to find a way to endure a little longer. Disappointed, Virgil ended the call and carefully fed the last of his burnable firewood into the flames. Fear and malnutrition soon took their toll. He began to hallucinate. He saw himself left with only a single stick, helplessly surrounded by a pack of wolves. Fortunately, it was just a nightmare. But upon waking, he still had to face the harsh reality of survival. His water supply was nearly gone, and only one can of food remained. To conserve his resources, he bent the can's lid into a makeshift funnel, carefully pouring the last bit of water into a bottle. But just as he took a small sip, he was startled. A rattlesnake was slowly slithering toward him. In the past, he would have immediately bolted. But now, this was nothing short of a gift from the heavens, a chance to survive. Moving cautiously, he reached for his knife, silently positioning himself for an attack. Then, before the rattlesnake could react, he lunged forward with all his might. But his luck was terrible. Not only did he fail to kill the snake, but in the heat of the moment, he also spilled most of his remaining water. Desperate, he cursed himself, but there was no changing the past. All he could do was make use of whatever he had to keep surviving. With no food and no water, he somehow managed to last 5 days. But then, in the distance, a tornado began to take shape, a disaster that hit him like a bolt from the blue. To stay alive, he frantically crawled into the wreckage of the plane. Just as he let out a relieved breath, a sudden knock on the glass behind him made his blood run cold. Even as he tried to appear intimidating, the woman approaching him showed no fear. She looked at him with ill intent, questioning what he was doing in a place like this. Panicked, Virgil lied, claiming he was just a scavenger. But it was an unconvincing lie. After all, who had come to a desolate wasteland, where even bird droppings were scarce, to look for junk? The sharp-witted woman deliberately took a sip of water in front of him, trying to pressure him into revealing something valuable in exchange for his life. She didn't expect that he would rather die than give up his fortune. But his nervous movements betrayed him. Her keen eyes followed the long drag marks on the ground, leading her past a sand dune, where she discovered the very thing he had been desperately trying to hide: the gold. Virgil tried to resist, but when the others attempted to dismantle his tent, Fear of losing everything left him no choice. Desperate, he swung his shovel with all his strength, smashing the woman's skull. Having never killed before, he felt no fear, only relief, as if he had found a lifeline. He rushed forward, rummaging through the woman's belongings for anything edible. Devouring the food greedily, he ate and drank to his heart's content. Once he was full, he immediately thought of disposing of the body. He dug a large pit in the nearby sand, dragged the woman's corpse over, and tossed it in without a shred of guilt. After throwing her in, he raised his shovel and swiftly buried the body. However, due to exhaustion, his work was far from flawless. It wasn't long before wild dogs unearthed the corpse. Terrified that he, too, might become prey, he drove the dogs away and hastily dragged the body to a more distant location. But his strength was failing him. By dusk, he was too weak to return. Without matches, he had no choice but to set the woman's body on fire and spend the night beside the flames. Thanks to her, he could survive a few more days. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly and just needed to wait for his companions to return. But the next day, when they arrived, they brought even worse news. At that moment, Virgil finally felt despair. He wanted to leave, but after relentless persuasion from his companions, he ultimately chose to stay. In the blink of an eye, another 5 days had passed beyond the promised deadline. Yet, even when he spotted a vehicle passing by, the man, consumed by greed, found his desire for wealth stronger than his will to survive. Dragging his broken body, he foolishly believed he could endure just one more night. But then, a monstrous tornado, transformed into a raging sandstorm, forced him back into what he thought was his safe haven. The swirling sands tore away his shelter's roof and water barrel, and finally, as if satisfied, ripped out the central support beam, before burying him beneath the desert. Perhaps the heavens, unable to tolerate his sins any longer, had come to avenge the woman he had wronged. Not only did a tree root pierce through his body, but fate also cruelly spared his life, just so he could experience the despair of dying slowly. Everything he managed to dig up was now filled with sand. Only that chunk of gold remained untouched, buried just as it had been in the beginning. He collapsed atop his so-called mountain of gold. When he awoke, he still refused to give up. Gritting his teeth against the agony, he pulled the wooden shard from his body with his own hands. Barely conscious, he pressed a red-hot iron fragment against his wound, the searing pain so unbearable that he blacked out once more. In his delirium, he saw her, the woman he had burned to death, standing before him again. The voice startled the man awake. He scrambled forward, desperate, thinking that salvation had finally arrived, only to hear more bad news. Keith wasn't coming back. At last, his despair overwhelmed him. He broke down completely, frantically urging for help, until he suddenly heard a woman's voice behind him. He turned around and nearly died of fright. The woman he had burned to death was standing there, perfectly unharmed. After a brief moment of shock, a strange sense of relief washed over him. He assumed he had already died and followed her to hell, until he noticed something different. The woman before him was not a ghost, but her twin sister. She asked him if he had seen her older sister. Guilt-ridden and terrified, he dared not answer. He hastily drove her away, but as soon as she left, everything went black. When he came to, the sun was already setting. Surrounded by a ring of fire, a rare flicker of guilt stirred in his heart. The sister, whom he had cruelly chased off, had left it burning to keep him safe from the wild beasts. But now, the flames were dying out. The hungry wild dogs, lurking in the shadows for days, finally closed in. Weak and defenseless, all he could do was scream at Keith to return. But by then, the fire had completely gone out. The dogs attacked. His desperate cries for help were crystal clear through the phone. Keith heard everything. Yet at that moment, he stood on a nearby hill, watching through binoculars, a satisfied smirk on his face as he observed the pack of dogs tearing Virgil apart, just like the scattered, half-eaten cans strewn around. Clearly, he had been here for a long time. Virgil, unaware of the betrayal, had gone completely numb, feeling every agonizing bite as his body was ripped apart, piece by piece. Only when he finally stopped moving did Keith start his car. Slowly, deliberately, he drove down, arriving at the scene just a little too late.